everybody, this is John Troutman for Cork.com. I'm standing here at the Kermit Lynch 2010 Portfolio Tasting in downtown New York City. And as you can tell from the noise and the crowd here, it is a big, big turnout. And I'm standing here with a gentleman who's responsible for some of the most important French wine importation in the United States over the last decade or two. So if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell everyone who you are.
My name is Bruce Nyers, and for the last 18 years, I've worked with Kermit Lynch. I'm his national sales director. Kermit and I have been friends for almost 30 years, but we've worked together for the better part of the last 20. Kermit's really the one who's responsible for those great imports. It's my job really to make sure that they get through the network needles, eye of the network needles, so to speak, and get distributed throughout the U.S. But Kermit is the discoverer and the importer of them, and they are indeed some of the greatest French and Italian wines you're ever going to discover yourself.
Awesome. You know, French wine is a category that a lot of people maybe necessarily aren't exploring all that it has to offer. They're focusing on Bordeaux and maybe Rhone, and some people who really know are going to the Loire. What's an appellation that you think is flying under the radar and something you'd really like to start seeing people explore a little bit more?
Well, there are several. You know, Kermit has built his reputation and his business to a large extent on wines that of that ilk. Kermit was the first person, for example, to import more than a Frank Schoonmaker Chateauneuf de Pape to the San Francisco Bay Area. Kermit was the first producer to bring in wines from Chinon. His whole business for the last 30 years has been based on finding wines that are flying under the radar. And right now, I think there are two really important categories that are flying under the radar. The one that I find myself enjoying the most, I think, is the wines of Corsica. Corsican wines are not widely distributed in the U.S. They're not widely known even by the most serious wine collectors or wine drinkers. But they represent some of the great values and, more importantly, some of the great wine drinking experiences, opportunities to find new wines, new varietals, new flavors. I find myself drinking Corsican wine far more frequently now than ever before in my life. Another area that I've had a lot of pleasure with over the last couple of years are the wines from the Savoie region. Savoie is the area around Albertville where the Winter Olympics were held back in 1992. And there was a flurry of interest in the wines from that region right after the Olympics, but it sort of died down. Kermit is now spending more time there. We now have two major properties that we import from that area. And again, it's one of those things that I find myself drinking and enjoying wines of the Savoie far more frequently now than ever before in my life.
Great. So, you know, walking around the room a little bit, going back to a category of wine that people are very familiar with, let's touch upon the Rhone. Coming off the 2007 vintage, there was a whole lot of hype about 07. I noticed today we're tasting some of the 08s, many of which are still barrel samples, probably set to be released in a few months from today. What can you tell us about 2008 Rhone?
Well, the 2008 vintage in the Southern Rhone is kind of a bookends vintage. The 2007 was fabulous for collectors. The 2009 looks like it's going to be even more fabulous. Those are the two vintages that one rarely encounters that close together, and they are indeed pretty close together with 07 and 09. 2008 obviously is sandwiched in there, but still it's a perfectly splendid vintage in its own right. Many of the producers in the Southern Rhone are comparing it to 1996. I go to France several times a year for Kermit, and one of my favorite visits is at Domaine Vieux-Telegraphe in Chateauneuf-du-Pape. The owner of Vieux-Telegraphe, Daniel Brunier, and his brother Frederick know whenever I show up there, if we're having a meal, I'm going to want to drink the 1996 Vieux-Telegraphe. It's a vintage that's not the most famous of the 90s, probably not among the 5 most famous of the 90s, yet it's my favorite. I'm looking forward to something much like that with the 2008 vintage.
Perfect. And Bruce, a lot of people are familiar with you for something that you have going on stateside out in California. Tell us a little bit about that project and what we should expect from your most recent vintage.
Well, I've been saddled with really two loves outside of my family throughout my career. A love of French and Italian wines that I'm able, obviously, to work with now with Kermit. But I grew up in the California wine business, at least after I got out of the Army, and found myself in San Francisco, and I was able to develop a career in the Napa Valley wine business. And I've always loved living there, growing grapes, making wine. Somehow, in my mind, I wanted to combine the two. And with Kermit, I've been able to do that. I divide my time between my ranch and vineyards and winery in the Napa Valley, and my office in St. Helena and the San Francisco airport, and the airport at Charles de Gaulle. So I've been able to balance my life in a way that really pleases me. I divide my time equally now between French wines and California wines. Clearly, the California wines that I grow and make at my winery have a decided French influence. Are they French wines? No, not by a long shot. They're made from grapes grown in California and under California's climate. But they certainly have a French idealism behind. If we walk around here today, we've got 24 producers who have traveled from France and Italy to show their wines. And they range from family businesses that have been around for 10 or 12 generations to new businesses that are enjoying their first generation. But all of these producers have in common a certain set of ideals and objectives, and I'd like to think their influence on me has let me apply those ideals and objectives to my business in California.
Awesome. Bruce, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, John.